Hello and welcome to Earth911 Conversations. That's our ongoing series of discussions about crossing the various divides that divide this country. The United States is currently very much a nation standing on two sides of a number of different perceived barriers, political barriers, age barriers, geographic or lifestyle barriers such as urban and rural divides. And we are very pleased to have Kevin-Wilhelm back. He is the CEO of Sustainable Business Consulting in Seattle, as well as an adjunct professor at Harvard University. Kevin, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again, Mitch.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you guys. And we're also joined by Danielle-Butcher. She is the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Conservation Coalition. We'll be referring to them as ACC throughout the conversation. And that you can find out more about ACC at www.acc.eco. That's a great resource to find out about ACC, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to mobilizing young people around environmental action through common sense, market-based, and limited government ideals. Danielle, you founded the organization in 2017. What drove the creation of the ACC?
Well, first of all, Mitch, thank you so much for having me. ACC was founded by a group of young people who were right of center and felt that the right of center didn't have an appropriate response to environmental issues, whether that be climate change, energy, conservation. We felt that it was an issue that was really slipping out of our reach, and it was something that we deeply cared about. And so as a group of young people, we decided to come together and do something about it to push our party in the right direction.
And what is the right direction for the Republican Party at this point?
Yeah, I think that it comes down to taking environmental issues seriously, recognizing them, not arguing with science, not having or continuing that history of denial, and actually taking steps to mitigate the issues that we are seeing as a result of climate change.
So, Kevin, let me ask you to jump in and share your perspective on interacting with the right. You speak from a generally left-center perspective. What do you see as the major challenges with regard to communicating about the real issue of environmental impacts and climate change? What's the challenge these days? Since, of course, Danielle just characterized a perfectly reasonable perspective.
Well, I would agree with Danielle in terms of what she said. And I think that, I don't really approach how we address climate change from a left-right perspective. I really focus in on what can be done and where's the action. And I think with each group or individual that you're trying to, encourage to take action, one of the problems that's been, really propagated on the left is that it's really about trying to convince people who don't necessarily support their view that they're correct, and that they need to understand the science and care about the polar bears and care about these issues from their perspective, as opposed to looking at it from what the other side's perspective is and what's most important to them. And so I completely agree with what Danielle's trying to do. I think that one of the things that we try and do in our work is really focus on kind of, where's the economic or business, opportunity for whoever you're talking to, so that, if you're talking about an issue like, a way to mitigate, carbon emissions, you don't get locked into a carbon tax, but you get looked into, other market-based systems that might work better for businesses or people who come from more of a conservative bent. And I think that that's one of the issues where there's real opportunity to, bridge the gap between kind of conservative, liberal, or left-right issues. It's just to kind of, focus on kind of where the bottom line benefit is, and where the kind of the economic and social justice interest is on both sides. Because I think there's a lot more common ground. We just get caught up in the language and the sound bites too often.
So, Danielle, what is your take on the right's perception of the left's demands that we focus on the reality of climate change? It seems to me that for you, at least for the younger generation of conservatives, that's already a settled question, and you agree with the science. What do you respond to that with?
So I actually really liked the point that Kevin was making about different perceptions and perspectives on this issue, because I don't necessarily think it's that conservatives don't believe that the environment needs to be protected or that climate change needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. I think it's more about the approach that people are taking. And when conservatives see something like the Green New Deal being the dominant force in these conversations, that's very off-putting to them. And so what we've found through our work time and time again is you may have someone who seems very skeptical or even denies the problem, but if you ask them if they'd be interested in a market-based approach or a limited government approach, and you explain to them what that means, they almost instantly turn around and say, yes, I support that, I believe in that, I would be on board.
So within the Green New Deal, what do you see as the acceptable components? Maybe we can start by trying to identify where people agree.
Yeah, I think that people agree that it's an issue and that we need to take action on it. I think that's pretty much about where the overlap ends. So I think my biggest problem with the Green New Deal isn't actually the policy itself, because there's not a lot of policy there. The Green New Deal was introduced as a non-binding resolution, and no legislation has come as a result of that. And so while we hear time and time again, we don't have time to wait, we have to act now, we actually waste more time arguing over the Green New Deal than we would if we were to just find things like carbon capture or nuclear energy that both sides can agree on and take steps forward on. And so that approach of like incrementalism is often criticized for being too slow, but it actually ends up seeing results more quickly because we spend less time debating and arguing.
So is part of the problem that this is cast in terms of a tax versus a usage fee when we talk about, for instance, carbon emissions? Kevin, you called this out a moment ago, a carbon tax. But we all, I think, recognize that there are costs that we have not recognized in the past. There are environmental costs that in some way need to be accounted for in this wider discussion. Is the problem that we're calling it a tax rather than a use fee?
To me, I think that is one of the problems. I mean, I know if I put out to 100 people across any scope of people, conservative, liberal, whoever, and you talk about taxes for pollution, there's so much confusion, and most people just have an immediate drawback against taxes. If we change the language of it to be more like, a revenue share opportunity, or where we're talking about tax shifting, like what I'm just use the oil revenue that comes out of Alaska is taxed, but how it gets to people's hands is a dividend, and so everyone in Alaska loves their dividend from the oil industry. They don't see it as a tax. In British Columbia, when they did a tax shift and put kind of a carbon tax in place, what they they offset it by giving people more of what they wanted. Was they lowered payroll taxes, they lowered business taxes, they even made a small incremental cut in the income tax, which everyone could get behind, and they did this by working to reduce pollution. That is a very different way of how to talk about it and how to present it. And it's than it is to just say we need a carbon tax. And I believe me, I'm someone who knows that we need to take immediate drastic action on climate change. And like in Washington State, where there was 2 carbon tax initiatives, I was right up at the front of the line saying, this is not going to work. This is not going to sell. You can't do this. You have to engage with people who are more conservative. You have to engage with people who are against taxes and hear what they're saying. But too often people are just like, nope, I've got an economic or I've got an agenda of how I'm going to go about this. And that's why it proved, incredibly unsuccessful.
So Danielle, what would you say in terms of how to frame the discussion about how money changes hands with regard to the environmental costs of human activity? Sure. You advocate for free market environmentalism, basically. What language would you use to convince people on the left that you share a concern about paying for those costs?
Sure. So the carbon tax is actually not an issue that ACC works on. There are a handful of organizations on the right of center that are solely dedicated to that issue, and they're contributing great things to this conversation. In our perspective, the conservative Republican base just isn't there yet. And if you start there, you're going to be turning them away from the issue at large. And so we would rather get them on board with the premise and then talk solutions, rather than coming on really strong with attacks right away. I don't see that as a productive way for us to make change.
So what premise do you want to have us all agree on? And I thought we had established a moment ago that the right does believe that there is a climate change issue. So what is the shared premise that we need to establish?
I think when you're talking about climate action, the utmost consideration needs to go to reducing emissions, period. That is the most important thing we can do to act on climate. And there are a number of different ways you can do that. You could pursue natural solutions. You could look at updating infrastructure. You could look into new technologies such as carbon capture or expanding nuclear, which is the largest source of carbon-free energy in the world. There are plenty of things that I think we could all agree on. I just don't see the carbon tax as one of those.
Well, how would you pay for the infrastructure, for instance? That's I think where we start, where the rubber meets the road, proverbially.
Sure. So ACC's position is actually not free market, it's market based. And so we believe that government intervention is sometimes necessary, but that government intervention needs to be strategic and intentional, and judged by the outputs that it can create, not how expensive it is or how many pages long it is. It's okay for the government to get involved with, say, startup technology and bring it to a place where it can compete in the market. But again, it's limited government and market based, and kind of letting the market lead and the government responds to that.
So, for instance, let's talk about putting the charging infrastructure into place for electric vehicles. Do you think it's a good idea at this point for the federal government or state governments to provide subsidies for the build out of that infrastructure, or is that the wrong way is that a distortion of the market?
I think that's something that you could very easily wrap into a COVID kind of stimulus package, and there'd be a lot of agreement on that because you're creating good jobs and updating our infrastructure, which is sorely needed. And I'm glad that you brought up this example, because I think Tesla in particular is a really good example of how the market and the government can work hand in hand. So you see with Tesla that Musk kind of spearheaded this initiative. And while it's true that he did receive government subsidies for his work, he was also taking a risk that no one else in the market was taking at that time. And because he took that risk and he made that investment, he now has a company that is a household name in less than 10 years and is basically iconic in the world of clean energy and EVs. Well,
on the other hand, the infrastructure that he's put in place has been tied in the antitrust sense to Tesla vehicles. And Kevin, I'd love to hear what you think about this. Do we need a way of enforcing some standards, open standards in terms of the charging infrastructure, so that these investments don't demand that you purchase a particular kind of vehicle to use them?
Yeah, first of all, I would just totally agree with what Danielle said. And I think that, the charging infrastructure, it does need, sometimes you need a government push, and then the market, the market can build off of that. So here, in Seattle, when the first, stimulus was put out under the Obama administration in 2009, we were one of the first regions to kind of get, a grant for charging infrastructure. So the government funded some of them, but then the market, ended up starting to put it, in other places. When buildings started, downtown offices in Seattle, Bellevue, or wherever, started having charging stations, then if you didn't have one, you kind of, rushed to make sure you did put them in there. And if you were trying to have your kind of sustainability credentials or reach your LEED certification, which is a market-based system, organizations moved to that. And so I think that Danielle hit it right on the head. But coming back to your point about what's needed on, on that, what drives me nuts about the EV industry was when the Nissan Leaf came out and was right out there, one of the first things was, hey, we're going to have one plug that works for every type of vehicle. And Tesla, because, and I don't know if this was ego by Elon Musk or whatever, wanted to find a cooler looking plug. And so you can literally, and I'm an owner of an electric vehicle, but I can literally go to multiple places where I can't charge, and I see 10 to 15 open Tesla charging stations, and one or two ones that will work for, a Chevy Bolt, an i300 for the for BMW, or a Chevy Volt, and you just are like, what is going on? And so I think where government could really make the biggest effort on this is they just create an adapter for the Tesla plug that you could use, because there's so much infrastructure that's there already that's not being used. You go down to the Rio Grande Valley on the border with Texas, you go to a Hilton Hotel, and they'll have 15 electric charging stations for Tesla, and there's not another one for any other type of vehicle within 15 or 20 miles. And so I think that there's opportunity for the market to work together to help build out that infrastructure. And as Danielle mentioned, it leads to jobs. It leads to updating the infrastructure. It reduces emissions. And while they're updating and putting in charging stations, they look at their parking lots and look for other, energy efficiency upgrades that they're doing at their properties, and take advantage of utility incentives. And so I think all of it is good. And I would, just agree with everything that Danielle said about that process.
This is something that the market has already responded to. My team took a 50-day road trip in an electric vehicle across the United States over the past few months leading up to the election. And there are adapters on the market so that you can utilize the charging stations that you need to, and the infrastructure is more readily available for everyone.
Well, I actually covered the emergence of the computing industry, and a lot of what we're talking about is very familiar in terms of standards for various types of connections and plugs. And there was a period of time when most computers started to align with those standards, but we've actually started to drift away again. And anybody who's purchased an Apple computer will know that their plug changes all the time, and then they only have the adapter that works for it. The thing that used to drive that wider conformance, which also drove down the cost of components across the computing industry, was standards. And the role of the National Institute of Standards and Technology has really been diminished over the course of the past 40 years. Is that something where it is a reasonable investment on the government's part to drive those standards and, in some sense, make American products the global standard?
I think this is something that could be left up to consumers. I personally am an Apple fan. I'm speaking to you from my MacBook with my iPhone right in front of me. And it's very annoying when the adapters change, yes, but that is something that I'm willing to deal with because I enjoy the product. And if consumers weren't willing to make that sacrifice or to have that annoyance, then Apple would be forced to respond accordingly. But this is, in my opinion, a situation where intervention really isn't warranted because companies are ultimately going to do what their consumers want them to.
So let's turn to a different topic, and that is, as we roll out a new infrastructure, obviously we need a great deal of education of a workforce to support that infrastructure. And I know, Danielle, that for the younger generation, educational debt is already a major issue. First, let me ask, what is ACC's position on how to support education, and do you see that as a potential agreement point for a bipartisan approach to funding the emergence of this new infrastructure?
Sure. So in terms of education policy, that's not an area that we engage in. And as a nonprofit, we oftentimes see our role as bringing education about these issues to people. And so one of our upcoming projects that I'm really excited about is the Market Academy that we're working on, which is essentially a hub for all environmental topics. And we will be providing videos and readings that kind of take a deep dive into different environmental issues and into different policies to educate our base on what a market-based approach could look like to these issues. And so we see our role not so much in education policy or in that sphere of things, but very much in educating our constituents.
Well, how do you envision actually training a workforce to do the work? I understand educating people about these issues, but when you talk about actually training people to connect wires or to write code, how does that happen? Is that an investment by individuals who take on a large debt and then pay that off? Or is that something that we could perhaps invest in a new educational infrastructure for?
I think this question is a little bit out of the scope of what ACC focuses on, and so I'm not able to answer on behalf of the organization.
Okay.
I personally would say that, when people go to college, they make a decision to, take out debt, and I definitely agree that that can be predatory and the practices definitely need change. But ultimately, it is a decision that they made with the knowledge that they would eventually have to pay that loan back.
How about you, Kevin? I mean, you teach at Harvard, which is not cheap. How do you envision the emergence of a new educational system to support the advanced economy that we're talking about creating?
Yeah, building off what Danielle said, I mean, we don't, yes, I teach at Harvard and I've taught at, 7 different academic institutions across, the country. My general feeling is, though, that the current model is broken. And so one of the things that we've done, and this is very much in line with what Danielle said, is we've designed educational modules that are very inexpensive, very accessible, all online. They're really focused on what individuals and companies need to take action on climate change or other various sustainability, social justice, environmental issues. Now, when I teach, I use these modules kind of in lieu of, requiring the students to buy a $300 textbook. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm an author of 5 books, I rarely use those. Mostly because I want that student who is in a community college where paying, $300 for a quarter is really a stretch. I want them to be able to get to the same access to the information that is needed to take action on these bigger, climate and environmental issues as the individual who can pay, $40,000 to $60,000 to $80,000 a year at Harvard. So I think that, our kind of approach has been access, and I agree with Danielle. Some for people that can go to a large, established university, that's kind of the deal they made, that they're going to take on this debt and they have to find a way to. I mean, it's an investment. That's how it's always been seen. There's no guarantee that you're going to get a job afterwards. Therefore, I think that the more we can get this information into the general lexicon, and making sure that people can get what they need when they need it, and as kind of that instant way of getting it online. I think that's the future. And I think that if we're going to make progress on climate change, I mean, I'll just tell you right now, I had a conversation with an organization last week that wanted me to build out a 9-month program on kind of the business of climate change and how to address it. And I said, nope, I'll build you a 8-week one, or maybe a 2-weekend boot camp. But no one I know can commit to 9 months of this right now. What they need is they need the information now. They need it actionable. They need what I can go in and work with in my business, and they need it inexpensively. And so we're totally changing this model within this organization from a 9-month certificate to a kind of a 4-day boot camp that's accessible and online, and it's really affordable and cheap. And I think, but we're not sacrificing the quality. We're just taking it out of the traditional delivery model.
So it sounds like where we have an agreement is that there is a need for good decision support information for people who need to make decisions about their participation in a renewable economy, a net zero economy, whatever word we want to use to describe the future. So I guess the other question here, once you move past the fact that we all agree that we need to provide a lot of information for people to make good decisions about their impact on the planet and their participation in the economy that will not be as damaging to the planet. This also sounds to me like a generational challenge, one in which younger people have been raised with a very high awareness of environmental impacts. But older people, and Danielle, I would direct this question to you first, are challenged by the fact that life just got more complicated because all of a sudden we have all this new information about what we're doing to the world, all the externalities that we used to not count into the economy. What's the dialogue within the conservative community about the difference between the way young people and older people see the environment?
I think for previous generations, from the perspective of a young person, it's about education and letting them know what the science says and letting them know that there are solutions to these problems that are still in line with their values. As I said earlier, the biggest resistance point, in our opinion, has been people who don't believe they have a choice in the way that these issues are addressed. And once you present them with a choice that has the same values that they have or makes the same points that they care about, they're much more likely to get on board. And I think that begins with having discussions about these issues and acknowledging that it's okay to have a different point of view. It's okay to not buy into the Green New Deal. It's okay to have questions about things as long as you're moving forward to a place where you're going to take action.
And with regard to the difference between an older conservative and a younger conservative, how do you talk to an older conservative who says, I don't want anything to do with climate change policy or climate policy generally? How do you convince them they need to?
Sure. I think it's really important to bring the issue of climate change close to home, because when you're talking with someone about climate change who is skeptical, it oftentimes seems like a very abstract, faraway idea, and it's kind of hard to grasp the severity of what it is we're dealing with here. And so if you're able to bring it back to a more local issue and say, this is an effect of climate change, they're much more likely to get it. So, for example, the wildfires that we've seen in the West, are they like directly climate change? No. But are they impacted by climate change? Absolutely. And it's about showing people that this is in their backyards, it's in their homes, it's affecting the people they care about, but we can still take action and do something about it.
Kevin, when you encounter somebody, liberal or conservative, who's older and doesn't understand this, how do you communicate the urgency of climate policy?
Yeah, I would completely agree with what Danielle says. Our approach is, it's super specific and hyper local to the people we're talking about. So, most people I know, climate change isn't, and this is left or right in their day-to-day issues. It's not, they might care about it, but it's not, an urgent thing that they can think about. But when you start talking about, hey, did were your kids this summer not able to go to camps or daycare because of, wildfires? And did you have to invest in filters in your home and your window systems because of, the poor air quality in the West Coast because of the forest fires? People get that and they can talk about that. And I think one of the issues, when you talk to, in the book that I wrote about how to talk to the other side, when we reach out to the coal communities of West Virginia and Kentucky and Pennsylvania, they don't want to hear about climate change, because what it really comes down to is you have to peel the layer back. They absolutely realize that the environment is going, is problematic and actions need to be made. But when you peel back, they feel like if you have to agree to the politics or the Green New Deal or something like that, they see it as a threat to their way of life. Mm-hmm. And you have to really peel back. And it's not that they're so much against climate change. It's that they're feeling left out. They're feeling like their community is no longer what it was. And so when someone comes and, promotes renewable energy in a coal community, there's like, oh, here you come again to take more of what's missing. And what they want is someone who's going to come to them and say, here's how we can build your community back. Here's how we can, build your tax base. Here's how we can, tackle some of your social issues or, issues with, what's going on in terms of, drug overdoses and everything from people who are in these communities are really suffering. And by really understanding that they're longing for really where their communities were thriving, that's how it needs to be approached, not just directly through climate change and saying we need to do it. And so, like what Danielle said, we usually start by listening. And listening is the key. So often when people on the left or right, they're shouting or they're coming at it by, let me tell you why you need to do it. Let me convince you. There's no convincing. You need to be listening and finding out where people's pain points are. And if you can help them address that specific pain point, then they're going to open up and be more willing to listen. And I found, with my conservative friends and organizations that I've talked to, that, they're expecting, someone like me to come at them. And when I just sit and listen and hear where their concerns are, we can find common ground pretty quickly.
And in some of the previous conversations we've done together, Kevin, it is consistently, in my experience, when opportunity is created, economic opportunity. We've also talked today about the fact that choice is the way of exposing those economic opportunities. When you look at the problem, is this primarily one of communication, or even, to put it very bluntly, marketing the challenge of how do we work together? And if so, what's the message that we need to share with the conservative community? And I'll ask the same with Danielle in a moment of the other option.
I don't think it's necessarily a marketing perspective, but it definitely is about communication. And I think, what I've kind of probably hit over the head is that it's really about listening and putting it in terms that really relate to someone and what they care about and what they're facing. And I think, as Danielle said, that that's really where it needs to be. And so if conservatives want to get liberals on board, or liberals want to get conservatives on board, they have to almost put them, not make assumptions, but they need to listen. They need to put themselves in the other person's shoes, understand what they care about, and then find the solution, as opposed to, running in with the solution and trying to, have the conversation. It's kind of like, and one of the problems is that we're so busy, we move so fast as a society, that we're not spending the time to really understand the other side. And I think that's really the key ingredient that's missing.
So Danielle, what themes do you think that we need to have as a shared conversation as a society?
Yeah, I think that in regards to the earlier question, I wouldn't necessarily say it's marketing, but I also wouldn't say it's broadly communication. I think it's somewhere in the middle there. And the term that I keep coming back to is messaging, right? It's how you approach something. It's in the style that you use. It's in the way that you're connecting people. Nobody wants to be lectured to or talked down to. And so we need to come together with an approach where we're going to have conversations that are civilized. We're going to listen, to Kevin's point, and we're going to try to find common ground, because too often I think people engage in political discussions where they're expecting a fight, and they're expecting to disagree, and they're expecting it to get heated. And that's just the absolute wrong approach. So
I completely agree with you in that. But what do you think the right set of themes for a conversation with a liberal that to forge a connection are when you start that conversation today?
I think oftentimes you have to cater it to what they are personally invested in or what they personally care about. But something that I found to be very effective is the theme of action now, going back to what I said a little bit earlier.
So with regard to, and putting the Green New Deal aside, what would you suggest we do today that we might have a conversation with across this political boundary?
Yeah, I think there are really good opportunities with COVID relief to build out stimulus packages that, help build a new green economy. I think that's something that conservatives would support, because it's reaching out to communities that need it and creating good American jobs. And it's also reducing emissions, as we stated earlier.
I think that's a very hopeful statement, because right now we are going to begin that conversation. So what advice do both of you have, starting with you, Danielle, to folks who are really kind of lost hope and are looking for hope or something to begin to work on in their lives?
Mm-hmm. I think people who are feeling lost and looking for hope already have some sort of idea of what it is that they'd like to see. And I think sometimes they spend so much time looking for it in other people that they don't realize people could be looking to them for that same thing. And so the advice that I would give is to lead by example, and to, as cliche as it may be, sort of be the change that you want to see.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So to do something and then tell other people about it. In other words, inform so they can make the same or a different decision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Kevin, what's your advice to folks who are looking for hope in terms of the dialogue within America?
Well, I'd certainly say what Danielle said is something we all need to do. And that's a great way to start. I found that, in building off our point about messaging, I found that by showing people kind of cool case studies where, and just kind of the stories telling aspect of it, of being able to show them, hey, company X did this and they saved this much money and brought down their emissions, or community Y did this, or this individual did these things, and this is how it benefited them, from a multiple, lens of positive benefits, including economic, that people get really excited about it. I think that I've never come across someone where I can say, hey, if you did this, you can save money, where they said, well, I'm not interested. They'll say, okay, tell me more. And then as I get them into this spot where we see them, okay, look at what you did. And, oh, by the way, isn't it cool that it reduced carbon emissions? And then before you know it, they start talking about people about, hey, look how I reduced my carbon emissions. And I think that there needs to be positive examples out there that people can latch on to, where they're looking for hope that relate to their circumstance, and where they say, this is a path forward, and this is a light that they need to see. And I think that if we can provide that, I think that's one of the most effective ways of getting people on board.
Well, I think this is a great place to stop, because we do agree that there is common ground. I want to thank you, Danielle, for joining us today, and Kevin as well.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, folks, that was Danielle-Butcher, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Conservation Coalition. You can find more about them at www.acc.eco. And Kevin-Wilhelm, who's the CEO of Sustainable Business Consulting, and that is located at sustainableBizConsulting, all one word, .com, sustainablebizconsulting.com. Check them both out and learn more and get involved. We'll be back with another Earth 911 conversation with Kevin-Wilhelm and another guest soon. In the meantime, I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host. This is Earth 911. And folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's take care of the planet. We'll be back soon.